Hello, I'm Corvette Hop and welcome to the channel. If this is your first time to this channel, go ahead and subscribe. Today we're going to work on this 1969 C3 Corvette. Today we're going to replace the oil pan gasket. I'm going to show you step-by-step procedure. With that, let's go ahead and get started, and hey, keep those cars on the road.
There are two types of oil pan gaskets for the C3 Corvette. One's a 4-piece and one is a 1-piece. I prefer using the 1-piece gasket. The 4-piece gasket is 0S5197C2 from the O'Reilly Auto Parts store. I prefer not to use this one because it's more prone to leaking. The gasket that I prefer to use is the 1-piece gasket, and the one that I'll be demonstrating today, the part number of that gasket is 0S34509T. Now the nice thing about the 1-piece gasket is no type of sealant at all is required. This of course is what the oil pan looks like. I actually have a chrome one installed on the car, and you'll see that here in a little bit. Now to remove the oil pan, of course you'll have to jack the car. I like using the Rhino ramps. They're very strong and sturdy. I back that up with jacks. As you can see, I have 5 jacks under the car, just in case something was to happen. Always think safety first when you're jacking the car. The next thing we'll need to do is go ahead and drain the oil and remove the oil filter. The oil drain plug, of course, is located at the bottom portion of the oil pan. Use a 9/16 socket or wrench to remove the oil drain plug. Go ahead and drain all the oil into an oil pan. And next, go ahead and remove the oil filter. This, of course, makes it easier to get the oil pan. Also, we need to change the filter and the oil anyways. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the collar pin and the nuts off the idle arm and the tie rod end. We need to do this so we'll have room to pull down on the components to allow us to remove the oil pan a little bit later. Now, we're not going to completely remove the idle arm or the tie rod. We're just going to simply loosen it to make room. Now let's go ahead and remove that collar pin and nut from that tie rod end that I mentioned earlier. Now we're going to go ahead and remove 2 additional nuts on the idle arm. These are mounted right to the frame. Keep in mind, we're only going to loosen them and not remove them altogether. The best way to find those 2 nuts is just simply follow the idle arm up and you'll see where it's mounted to the frame. You can see it right here as you see the ratchet turning. There are 2 nuts that need to be loosened. One on the lower portion of the idle arm and one just above it. Again, the only reason we're doing this is to loosen some of the steering components, allowing us room to get at the oil pan and remove it. This has allowed the steering components to loosen up nicely. Now we'll go ahead and start removing the oil pan bolts.
Okay, we're using a 7/16 socket.
There are a total of 9 bolts on each side of the oil pan. Most of them do use a 7/16. However, the 4 corner bolts use a 1/2 inch socket. Now let's get a closer view of one of those oil pan bolts. Now go ahead and remove the 9 bolts on the other side of the oil pan. This is one of those corner bolts that I talked about earlier that uses a 1/2 inch socket.
Now this metal band here helps keep an even tightness of the bolts all the way across the perimeter of the oil pan. This is definitely a good thing to have. Some of the old oil pans don't have this, but definitely a good thing to have.
The metal band also helps me from warping the oil pan, just in case I tighten those bolts down too tight. This is another one of those half-inch corner bolts that I mentioned earlier. Now I know you can't actually see the bolts, but there are only 4, and there is one in each corner of the oil pan. Now on this corner bolt, I actually have the chassis ground wire connected to it. Of course, not all C3 Corvettes have a ground wire at this location. And finally, the last of the 18 bolts being removed. Now you can go ahead and work the oil pan out. You may notice me pulling down on the power steering component. That of course would not be possible if I didn't loosen the idle arm and the tie rod ends earlier. You may notice how easy it is to remove. One reason is because we already removed the oil out earlier. Now I have seen some people try to remove these with oil still in it, but that makes it extremely difficult. Now I'll go ahead and remove the gasket. Now let's go ahead and install the new oil gasket and the oil pan. This is the placement of the oil dipstick that comes down from the top of the engine. Make sure it fits correctly in the hole from the gasket. Next we'll go ahead and tighten down all 18 bolts, 9 on each side of the oil pan. Now we're just going to tighten down the bolts finger tight just to make sure that the gasket fits all in the right place. Now the 4 corner bolts can be very difficult. I use a ratchet with an extension to put them into place. Once all the bolts are in place, we will now go ahead and torque them down. The 4 corner bolts are torqued down to 18 foot-pounds. The remaining bolts are torqued down to 8 foot-pounds. You may notice that when I install the bolts, I install them in a cross pattern. The left side of the oil pan, then move to the right side, then back to the left side. This helps to ensure that the oil pan is tightened down evenly. By the way, in case you're wondering, I got the chrome oil pan from AutoZone, part number 9425. It was about $80. The torque values I provided were in the instructions from Field Pro Gasket. Once all the bolts are torqued down, go ahead and install a new oil filter and tighten down that oil drain plug. Basically all we're doing is reinstalling everything in reverse order. I'm using a 9/16 ratchet to tighten down the oil drain plug. Next, we need to reinstall the 2 nuts that we removed from the idler arm and the tie rod end. Also install those 2 cotter pins, and then tighten the 2 nuts on the upper portion of the idler arm. Once the tie rod and idler arm nuts are reinstalled, cotter pins installed, and the idler arm is tightened back down, go ahead and do an inspection of the entire area. During the inspection, look for proper hardware or any other things that may be wrong. Now, the next to the last thing to do is go ahead and fill it up with oil. I prefer to use VR1 1030 weight with high zinc in my car. Of course, here is the location to fill it up with oil. This car takes about 5 quarts of oil. Lastly, once the oil is added, go ahead and start the car up and check it for leaks. With that, we had no leaks and mission complete.
Hey, I hope you learned something today. If you did, go ahead and subscribe right here. And hey, keep those cars on the road. you.